We have the right to self-government, to self-determination of land. And the people that are here are going to go back and continue the struggle. This is not an end, it's only a beginning.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of The True Canadians, the podcast. I'm your host, David Wylynko. The podcast is based on the book by the same name, The True Canadians, which I wrote with Métis writer Patricia Russell. And we have the honor and pleasure today of being joined by Bailey Oster. Welcome, Bailey.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Bailey has fulfilled many roles related to projects on youth and the advancements of women's issues, as well as with the Métis National Council in the area of national and international relations. Is that right? Intergovernmental, yeah. So we're going to talk about all of that, beginning with how it came about that you became interested and got involved with the Métis Nation of Alberta, which now is known as Otipemisiwak Métis Government. How did that come about? What were the roles that you undertook, and how did you feel about it all when you left that adventure?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long story. I've been a proud citizen of the Métis Nation of Alberta for a good chunk of my life. I got my card and I was, I think, 15 years old because my mom thought it was important that I be involved in the political side of things as well. So I went to the M&A one day to get a replacement card, and I knew the head genealogist at the time, Beatrice Demetrius, who was responsible for kind of starting the registry system and the genealogy that the Métis Nation does. And I knew her, and she was kind of saying, she's like, I could use a genealogy assistant or a research assistant just part-time. So I started working with her just kind of on a whim. I'm like, I could use a job after school. So I started doing that. And when I graduated later that year, I came on full-time with registry at the Métis Nation of Alberta. And I learned so much about Métis history and Métis genealogy and Métis, even just like what Métis names are. A lot of the last names that we hear over and over again throughout our history. I learned a ton about kind of that side of things within the Métis Nation. And I really enjoyed learning about genealogy, and it taught me a huge amount about the Métis Nation as a whole. But it wasn't my true passion. As interesting as it is, it was never something I kind of hoped to do for the rest of my life. So then when a position came up in the youth team, I jumped on it and I applied for a youth coordinator position, and I did the interview and I got the job and started January 2019.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and something a lot of people don't know is at the time it wasn't even its own department. It was health, children, and youth department. So it's kind of all three major areas kind of crammed into one department, into one team, which is a little bit too much for one department to handle, in my opinion. So a resolution had gone up at a previous AGM that had said, let's split these into three and each have their own departments. So I kind of came on just as that was happening, just as the youth department was starting to transition out and have its own department. And so I started as a coordinator, and my job was to coordinate regional coordinators. So we were hiring on regional youth coordinators to work around the province. Because at the time, if we wanted to do a youth program, say a beading program up in Grand Prairie, someone based out of Edmonton would have to drive to Grand Prairie to do that beading program. So it was hugely inconvenient. You only had a staff of maybe 4 to 6 people at most, having to run programs across the entire province. Not very convenient. So what we did was we hired youth coordinators. We hired 6 of them, one in each of the 6 M&A regions at the time. So there was a regional coordinator in Lac-La-Biche, one in Bonnyville, Alberta, one in Calgary, one in Edmonton, one in Slave Lake, and one in Peace River. And so those youth coordinators worked out of the regional offices to develop programs and services that were specifically tailored towards youth in their regions. So that was kind of my side of things. As the youth department kind of came in to be its full department, we kind of had 2 main sections. We had my side, which is the regional coordinators, and we had the other side, which was kind of the provincial events and services. So you might see on social media, events will come up like the Youth and Seniors Gathering, which we have every year and is hugely successful. Things like the Headstrong Mental Health Summit, and now it's called the Wellness Summit, I believe, hugely successful. We also have, yearly youth camps, these large provincial events. Now the youth team also runs Alberta Métis Fest, which was something that was started while I was working there and is now, I think, the largest event that M&A does, or the Otipemisiwak Métis Government runs. So there's kind of 2 main kind of sections within the youth department. But of course, we all worked very closely together. So I supported them. They supported me. Um, And we also hired on our director. So she was a youth herself, and she began to build the department into what it became, which is now a really well functioning department. We have our own youth programming center, which is something that kind of came into reality while I was working there, which is probably the biggest thing I worked on and was super exciting.
Hmm.
So I quickly, after kind of being hired after about 6 to 8 months, I was moved into a managerial position because I'm like, hey, I'm coordinating coordinators. This is kind of what a manager does. And so our director agreed, and I moved into a managerial position where I managed the 6 regional coordinators, and that was my main job up until 2022, November 2022. I became director. And like I said, one thing I had done while I was a manager was I had written a grant that was for the Urban Partnership for Indigenous Peoples infrastructure stream, which gave us the money to buy our own youth building. So I basically spent the entire time I was director, I started on as director, and I closed the sale of that building.
Wow.
And then the entire year I worked as director was moving into the building, getting all the staff into the building, and turning it, basically renovating the entire thing into a fully functioning youth center,
Wow.
which is now
Wow.
fully open. If you check out the Métis Youth Instagram or Facebook pages, they're having regular programming there. They're having youth nights. They're having youth group, cooking classes, jigging classes. It has a jigging studio. It has a library section. It has a kitchen. It has classrooms. It has tons of office space for staff. It's just a really incredible space. So kind of that was my last year there as director, was kind of taking that dream and putting it into a reality, which is really cool.
That's fantastic. So when you look back on it now, I mean, you've laid out all these amazing initiatives, but now you had a bit of a chance maybe to reflect, because obviously you're still very much involved in, seeing what's going on in the Alberta scene. What's your biggest, if it's possible to say so, what's your biggest takeaway in terms of like the progress you might have seen, in terms of being able to, do things that benefit the youth?
I mean, just the growth in the youth department was astounding. It was truly just a really tight-knit group of Métis youth who are working. We were Métis youth working to support Métis youth. As Métis youth, we knew what Métis youth wanted because we were Métis youth. And it was kind of like the train was moving, and we just had to go and do as much as we can, as fast as we can, while those opportunities came up. So it often felt like we had no control, but we were doing so much work and so much progress was happening. It was incredible how quickly we grew, and how much stuff we could get out just by pure gall. Like, we didn't know what we were doing, but we were doing a lot. And I think one of my favorite things that came out of that experience was seeing, I guess, kind of our main idea of what we wanted to accomplish was to connect youth to their culture, to their community, and to each other. So we would bring youth would come to our programs. So say our youth camp, we'd have youth come to our youth camp, and over that week at youth camp, they would connect. They would connect to their Métis culture, they would connect to each other. So they would learn traditional arts, they would learn how to bead, they would learn how to skin beaver, they would learn how to fish, they would learn how to make moccasins, and they would be truly immersed in their culture. But another thing they were doing is they were making lifelong connections and friendships with each other. And I left that youth camp and I sobbed the whole way home. It was so impactful.
Oh, wow.
It was so amazing, like, how impactful that was. And then what I saw, and this is my biggest takeaway, was that, 6 months later, we did our Headstrong Mental Health Summit in Grand Prairie, and I saw youth message, like, commenting with each other on Facebook being like, "Hey, wanna come to this event with me?" And these were youth that met at camp and are still friends to this day.
Wow.
And they were going to our events, not even really to attend the event itself, but so that they could reconnect with each other. Even though one lives in Elk Point and the other lives in Calgary, they wanted to come to our events because they wanted to see each other. And that was really what I thought was the best, was like being able to see that community being built actively.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, because I'm not Métis, and I grew up in the suburbs of Winnipeg and Fort Garry, and I often mention that in the podcast.
Yeah.
Interestingly, because Fort Garry was the name of the fort where Louis Riel, who I think was a youth at the time,
Yep.
and maybe only ever was established a provisional government. I guess I'll ask it this way: why do Métis youth need to be connecting with Métis youth rather than just being part of the general urban society that everyone else partakes of?
No, that's a good question. I mean, relationality and Wokotowin and kinship ties are so key to our culture. And I feel so much more connected to the Métis community than I feel to any other community, and I truly feel like it is core to who I am as a people and who I am as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned Louis Riel as a youth, and I have a lot of anger when I hear youth don't wanna be involved. I hear that all the time, and I heard that all the time. And I was actually at a candidates forum for district captain a couple of weeks ago, and some of the candidates were saying, "Youth don't wanna be involved. Youth don't wanna be involved."
Wow, even now.
Yeah, and I'm like, one of the people who were saying it was a youth. And I stood up, and I'm not one to usually speak up in, like, a public forum and get angry, like, I'm not that person, I'm very much an introvert, but I got up and I said, "That is some BS that youth don't wanna be involved." A quarter of Citizens Council right now is youth. There's at least 5 or 6 Citizens Council members who are youth
Of the Otipemisiwak
of
Métis
the
Government.
Otipemisiwak Métis Government. Our youth event sell out without fail. Youth and seniors is hugely attended. Youth want to be involved. Youth want to connect to each other, and we're here to facilitate that. And I think it's because there's such a desire to be around people who understand them and to understand who they are and where they come from and who their family is. I can go to anywhere in the homeland and I can meet a cousin. It was almost a joke at the M&A that every second person I would meet would be my cousin because Métis families are so broad and because our kinship ties are so wide. And I think just having that sense of belonging and connection is so vital to who we are as a people.
So let's talk about this for a minute. I guess what I'm gonna get at is where outside of the building of those relationships that might have a benefit, because the Métis sort of playing a come from behind game, to use a sports analogy, having been dispossessed and lost their land, lost I mean, I don't think you could say Métis ever lost their sense of pride or the sense of who they are, but they were very much were conscious of the idea of being the forgotten people, that being left out of the rest of the colonial society as it was rampaging across the West and whatnot. So why is there a I don't know, inferiority complex is the right word. I mean, I don't really think that'd be accurate because everybody I've met who's Métis doesn't have that. But is there what do people give you a sense that they feel that that they need like a leg up, or they need more connection? They need to have opportunities because they're not generally there for them out in society in general.
I think so. I mean, I think at a very basic human level, everyone strives and everyone wants connection, wants community. And I think Métis Nation gives us that just on a very basic level of like, what do we create as people? When I dig kind of deeper into it, if I think about, I'm very lucky in that my family never hid that they were Métis. I know that's a very common story we hear that like, oh, my grandma or my grandpa or my Kookum or my mushum, they knew that if I could blend into white society, I would be better off. My grandpa was always very proud of being Métis.
Mm.
But even when my mom asked him when I was a baby, "Do you wanna be grandpa or do you wanna be mushum?" And he said, "Whatever is easiest for her." So I called him grandpa my whole life
Mm.
because he knew that I would get more flack from my schoolmates if I called him mushum. And I think that's changing. Previous generations, it was something to be shameful of. It wasn't something to walk into the world and be proud of. So they hid it. And that's caused, I think, a lot of disconnection and a lot of issues and a lot of people wanting to come back into the Métis Nation, into this community and proclaim who they are and say it proudly and say it loudly. It gives you a sense of confidence. It gives you a sense of, home and kinship ties. And that's what I feel like when I tell people I am Métis and proud of it. But that's new. That's only within the last 20, 30 years. I think that is something like I'm very lucky I grew up in a time where I could say proudly I am Métis. But for my mom's generation, my grandpa's generation, that wasn't the case.
So it's basically what we're talking about is racism.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you wanna put it very bluntly, absolutely.
Well, just as an extension of that, and then we'll ask you this, and we'll take a short break. What have been and are or will be the biggest challenges for young people? Is it about getting education? And the Rupert Land Institute, of course, is doing this amazing job in Alberta here, and I guess they have other similar organizations in other provinces. Or is it about access to housing? I mean, youth can often stumble, right? They've got peer pressures that might be coming from outside that can involve substance abuse, that can involve criminal. I mean, I was at Bowden Institute. I did a reading there, and there was a certain contingent of Métis there, and most of it seem to be like not serious crimes per se, but well, actually, I guess there's no non-serious crime if you're if you're in an institution. But what do you see is most typically like the big hurdle that if you get past that when you're 18, 19, 20, and you get into your early to mid 20s, then you're gonna be okay to the extent that you can be okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I think I want to take a really holistic view of it. When I was working on the youth department, we would talk about, how do we support youth housing? How do we support youth in education? How do we support youth in all of these kind of areas? And what it was always coming back to is we could tie everything back to culture. If youth feel like they are supported by their culture and by their community, they're going to have better outcomes in any area. In health, if you want to talk about mental health and suicide,
Mm.
culture. Like, yes, absolutely, you can put mental health programs in, but if youth feel like they have somewhere to go back to, if they feel like they have a community of like-minded people, they're gonna have better mental health outcomes. If they feel like they have a community that can support them, they're gonna have better education outcomes. Métis youth experience many of the same hardships as all the other youth in Canada. Often it's amplified because of, a lack of access, racism, etc. But I think what it comes back to is being able to connect youth to community, be able to connect youth to culture and to each other. And that, I think, does a huge part in supporting youth in having better outcomes across the board in all areas where they might be struggling.
Sounds to me like the word we might be looking for, or might be an apt description is countering alienation.
Yeah.
And so what this does, everything that you've just been describing for the last 20 minutes is it helps to counter that sense of feeling dispossessed, the sense of feeling alone, the sense of being cast to whatever whims of society is imposing upon you, and which can include still racism,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And I mean, nowadays, everyone has a phone in their hand that can, connect you to people all around the world and can do a lot of good. But let's not, lie to ourselves. It can also do a lot of harm. It can isolate us. It can, go scrolling through Instagram, judging yourself on every single person you see. What's a better counter to that than going into community, sitting down at his kitchen table and drinking tea and playing crib? Like when I'm with my family and we're having a New Year's party where everyone's dancing the drops of brandy, I'm not scrolling TikTok.
Yeah,
And when do I feel better about myself? It's when I'm with those
with
people.
people.
It's not when I'm lying in my bed mindlessly doom scrolling. And so I think to counter that alienation, culture and community and the arts and all of that is such a great access point.
I don't know. Is it ironic that social media and the internet that's supposed to be giving us connections everywhere, but they're what's that expression? Like a mile wide and an inch deep.
Yeah. Yeah.
500 likes on something, but you kind of still walk away feeling, well, but I didn't actually talk to somebody about that in person,
Yeah.
which is more like, an inch wide and a mile deep,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think media and social media and technology has its place. And if used correctly, it can connect people. But I think you need to be really careful. And I think there's a lot of bad that could come with that. And it's
Hmm.
where's the line? And I think just making sure that you have somewhere in real life where they can go out and connect with people one on one. I think that's really important to countering a lot of the negatives that technology has brought with us.
Well, there's a good place to take a break. We're speaking with Bailey Oster. When we come back, we'll be talking about women's issues and some of the great things that Bailey's been doing on a broader scale outside of Alberta, but also obviously in part for Alberta and elsewhere in the country. We'll be right back.
Hello, this is Audrey Patra. Today, we are talking to a remarkable young lady, Bailey Oster. When I think about Bailey, I think about all the work that she has done from the beginning as a young lady, looking to what she wanted to do as far as education, looking at the research that she wanted to do, and then coming forward and being part of the Métis Nation in many, many ways. Bailey truly got involved with our youth programs and services and was there to do anything that she felt was needed to promote the youth of the Métis Nation, like the Keeping It Real podcasts. She also was very involved in the book, The Stories of Métis Women, the tales My Kookum Told Me. A real natural for her because she was one of those young people that did sit and listen to what people told, the traditional stories of long ago. She became the vice president of the New Dawn Women's Society to make sure she was part of the voice of our women in Alberta. She also was recognized by Edify magazine as the top 40 under 40 in Edmonton. It's amazing what this young lady has done. Coming from a traditional Métis family around St. Paul de Métis, a young lady who truly knew her history, had a great understanding of the Métis Nation at a very young age, and was very proud to be able to bring it to people all over the country.
Welcome back. We're here with Bailey Oster, and we've been spending some time talking about your involvement in and the advancement of youth issues, and that was very informative. But you've worn other hats, and one of them, over much of that same time or longer, was your role as a vice president with the New Dawn Métis Women's Society. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, since 2015,
Yep.
did you say? Yeah. Wow. So, my gosh, you must have been pretty young.
I think I was 21.
So, vice president at 21, unless you're starting your own company and you're some .com genius, that's a pretty ambitious title. How did this come about? What's the organization been up to, and what's its mandate, and what do you consider have been main accomplishments over that whole period of time?
Yeah, I mean, New Dawn Women's Society was an organization started, some of the original founders, Doreen Putra, Beatrice Demetrius, Norma Spicer, just to name a few. It was started basically to represent the interests and the needs of Métis women in Alberta. This was long before the MNA had the structure it has now. Just like as a bit of a reference, when I started the Métis Nation of Alberta in 2016, so a year after I became vice president, or a year after I became vice president in New Dawn, I think there was maybe 30 staff. Now there's probably 200. So it grew very rapidly over the time I was there. So there wasn't the same resources in place to support Métis people in the province. It was funding and access and things like that. So I basically I became vice president by accident. People think that's like I'm joking, but I'm fully serious. I was 21 years old. I was still in university. I was a broke college kid. And my mom had been asked, "Hey, can you come to this New Dawn Métis Women's Society meeting?" And this is the first I'd ever heard of this organization. But my mom was busy at the time, and they needed a certain amount of delegates from each region. And it was a very small organization, very little funding. They were kind of just doing things off the back of their desks with the resources they had, as Métis people do. So they asked, "Hey, Bailey, would you be interested in coming?" Just to have a voting seat basically at the table. And me, again, being a broke college student, said, "Is there food there?" And they're like, "Yes, there's going to be breakfast, lunch, and dinner." I said, "Okay, then I'll go. Anything for a free meal, right?" So I show up to this meeting and I meet so many amazing people, amazing women that I still know and love to this day. This is actually where I met Marilyn Lizee, who's the president of New Dawn and has worked at the MNA for many years. She's an incredible woman. And so I was sitting at the table and they're like, "All right, we're going to do elections for a new board. The previous board, they're all stepping down. They wanted to start the organization and then pass it on." What I didn't know was that they wanted to get a youth on the board.
Mm.
So all of these little old ladies who I love more than anything in the world, despite what I'm about to say, were conspiring behind my back. They're like, "We need to get a youth on the board." And so they said, "Bailey, would you want to run? Would you want to run?" And I said, "No, I'm okay. Probably not." And to be fair, I had been considering it, but like I said, I'm an introvert. I don't really like to put my name forward for these things. So then they're reading off all the nominations and they said, "And nominated by," and they said one of the women's names, "Bailey Oster. Do you accept the nomination?" And, me being like a pathological people pleaser, I'm like, "Sure." And so then they're like, "All right, there's 4 people running for vice president. Everyone has to give a speech."
Oh, wow.
And so I was like, "Oh, okay." And I think one thing that's really lucky about me and my personality is that when I get nervous, rather than being quiet, I get really intense and I start speaking like I'm like the most passionate person in the world about something. It's just like a weird coping mechanism. So I got up there and I gave the most rousing speech I could come up with. And then I ended up winning vice president.
Wow.
And about 2 weeks after I won, or maybe a month after I won, I got a call from Marilyn and she said, "Do you want to go to Ottawa? There's a pre-inquiry meeting into the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry."
Right.
So that was the first thing I did as vice president of New Dawn. Was I had never flown on a plane by myself before. And I flew to Ottawa, and I met so many incredible women from across the homeland and had some of the most difficult discussions I've ever had in my life about women who had lost family members or who had been a woman who had been affected by these really serious issues. And I got about 2 days' notice, and I was in Ottawa, and I had one of the most impactful experiences of my life. And that kind of set the stage for what the next like 10 years would become. So that was kind of how I got involved, and I've been vice president ever since. And it's kind of been a process of just working with Métis women from across Alberta. We did elections in each of the regions, so we have elected regional representation.
Wow.
And yeah, and New Dawn actually we pushed to get a elected women's representative into the Otipemisiwak Métis government.
Right. Right.
Because when the first draft of the Constitution came out, I read it and immediately realized there's nothing about women. There's no representative of women into us LGBTQIA plus people. And so I sat down with New Dawn. We were at Métis Crossing at a meeting, and I said, "This isn't okay. What should we do?" And New Dawn, as a group, said, "We need to write a letter to the Constitution Commission, and we need to state the need to have an elected, paid position on council to represent the rights of Métis women." And so we wrote that letter, we sent it in, the next draft of the Constitution came out, and that person is enshrined into our Constitution.
Wow.
So I think that's probably one of the biggest impacts New Dawn has had.
Was
just
to
advocacy.
get that role, and that role in turn having what kind of impact that otherwise wouldn't be brought to bear if that person didn't have that position.
I mean, now we have an elected person who's paid to represent the right of Métis women
Mm-hmm.
in Alberta, across Canada. So right now it's Amy Grauman. She's the elected women's representative and the secretary for the advancement of women and girls within the Otipemisiwak Métis government. And she gets to talk with like Canadian ministers from across the country
Mm.
to advocate for the rights of Métis women. And that was really important because within New Dawn, like I said, we're a small organization. We don't have a lot of funding. We're all doing this off the side of our desk.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard to ask women to give so much of their time and energy to something with no money to pay them, with no funding. So to have someone who it's their job and they get paid to do this work was really important to us.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess she's embraced it
Oh yeah.
off to the races.
Yeah, and she's an incredible Métis woman, and she's kind of spent her career as like an actress and a playwright.
Yeah.
First, basically pushing forward stories of Métis women.
Well, so when we were off air, you mentioned that New Dawn played a role in this amazing anthology, and you mentioned Marilyn. It's called Stories of Métis Women, Tales My Kookum Told Me, with a foreword by Audrey Patra, who does our interlude for the podcast, retired president of the Métis Nation in Alberta. So what inspired this, and when did it come out, and how have you felt about the impact of it, and since it hit the shelves?
Yeah, I like to actually say, like, I like to joke that I became vice president by accident. I also like to joke that the book came about by accident. So in 2018, so my mom, Colette Patra, is a Indigenous librarian, and she works for the government, basically advocating for Indigenous library services
Ew.
within Alberta. And she did a presentation at our 2018 New Dawn AGA that was about digital storytelling and the power of sharing our stories in virtual formats to be able to share them for family, for outside of just your immediate family and also for future generations. For an example, I like to kind of talk about before my grandpa passed away in 2020, my mom sat down with him and my Auntie Doreen and my Uncle Willie and different members of the family and asked them about their childhood, what it was like growing up, what they did as they got older. And she sat and she recorded them, just like you and I are sitting here recording this. And then she took that video and she put it onto a website. And then she sent it to me and she sent it to my cousins and she sent it to the family, amongst a variety of other media and things like that. And so now when I'm missing my grandpa, I can go on to that Wix website and I can listen to him tell his story of what it was like to grow up as a young Métis boy.
Wow.
I can listen to him talk about how proud he is of me and my sister for what we've accomplished. And so she was basically talking about digital storytelling and the power it can have to basically share our stories intergenerationally. And after her presentation at this AGA, what I noticed was all of the women around the table were just talking about how they could tell their stories,
Mm.
how they could share their stories of growing up so that we have them. Because for many years, Métis stories weren't told. Métis stories were, hid under the shelf. Don't talk about it. Don't tell people who you are.
Yeah.
But now all of these women were like, we want to tell our stories. How do we tell our stories? So Marilyn, being the forever optimist she is, she said, Bailey, we should write a book. This is in 2019. The book came out in 2021, just to kind of give you a time frame there. And I said, sure, Marilyn, whatever. And then in my mind, I was like, people don't just write books. It's not just a thing you can do,
Mm.
which of course it is.
A lot
But
try.
yeah, a lot's right. It's very hard. Very rarely does a book actually get published.
Usually the publishers are the ones who go and solicit the books that are going to get published.
Yeah, so it was kind of like, that's never going to happen. So, for 2 years, Marilyn kept saying, we should write a book. And I kept saying, like, yeah, sure, why not? But never really taking any steps to do it. And then 2020, COVID hit, of
Mhm.
course. It's end of March 2020. And we were sitting at home, not doing a whole lot. Couldn't leave our houses. We all remember. And my mom goes, I actually know a publisher who's talked about wanting to do Métis stories.
Mm.
And I was like, you mentioned this now? So she's like, well, let me connect her and Marilyn. Maybe her and Marilyn will want to work on a book together. Me not really thinking I'd be that involved, honestly. So we have, I think it was March 28th, 2020. We have a meeting. It's me, my mom, and Marilyn, and this publisher, out of Dervile and Uproot Books, Dr. Lorraine Shiba.
What was the company called?
Dervile and Uproot
Right,
Books.
right.
So we had a meeting with Lorraine. We sat down and we told her our idea. We want to tell the stories of Métis women in their own words. And that was kind of all we had. And Lorraine, she loved the idea. She's like, you know what? There is a hunger, there is a need for Métis stories. Um, there's not a lot out there. And throughout the past few years, more and more have come out. Of course, the True Canadians have come out to tell the story of Métis Nation of Alberta. Northwest is Our Mother by Jean Terry came out. A variety of books have come out, but at the time, there was really limited literature on Métis history and Métis stories, and even less about Métis women. There was almost nothing out there. So she said, I love it. And then she looked at me and said, Bailey, do you want to edit? And again, pathological people pleaser. I said, sure, having no idea what I was getting myself into. But then, of course, it was COVID. We need to figure out how to get the stories of, 10 plus women without being able to go into community, which would have been how we would have done it. As the months went on, it was looking more and more obvious that we wouldn't be able to go to big events. So we basically sat down, we put together a list of women we knew who had very, important stories to tell, who we respected a lot and who we looked up to in the community and who we thought might be interested in doing it. And then some of them we sat down with on Zoom. Some of them you know, they sent us their story in writing. Some of them we took videos of at the M&A office with a professional videographer who had worked at the M&A. Just basically that saying, we took their stories in a variety of ways, and we kind of talked with the publisher and we said, we should kind of separate this book into sections. So we have the first section, which is like the introduction of the women. How did their story start? What was their childhood like? Who are they? The second section was about culture and what it means to be Métis. And through that, I looked at, language, art, hunting and trapping, like all of these things that are so pivotal to being Métis. The third section was, of course, we want to talk about the celebration, but we need to talk about the dark times. We need to talk about, the struggles the Métis have gone through, residential schools, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, all of these issues, like things that make script system, racism, these things that the Métis have experienced. We need to talk about them as they happened, in the words of the people who experienced them. But I didn't want to leave it at that because the Métis are resilient people and they're a celebratory people. So I wanted to end the book on where these women are now, the impact they've had on their community, and just kind of really celebrate who they are as people. So that being said, the book is kind of split into 4 sections. I went through and I pulled their stories and I tried to pull out as much information as I could to put into the book. And then the book came out summer of 2021. And I can truly say it was more successful than I ever could have imagined. I kind of thought it would come out, a few people would buy it, and I'd never hear about it again. I think in my brain, that's how I was coping. And then it hit the Alberta bestseller list many, many weeks in a row. I was doing interviews with CBC and APTN and the Globe and Mail, and yeah, it was just a really incredible experience, and I'm still finding that it's impacting people to this day.
That's what I was going to ask you next. How you feel about it? Because books can, they can hit the streets and then a month later, okay, well, that was fun.
Yeah.
Or they can start to have some lasting impact, and then eventually something becomes thought of as a classic, which takes decades and so on. And think about like The Great Gatsby, which was dusted off, decades after the author actually passed away, and then suddenly became an overnight sensation. So yeah, how do you feel about it now at this point, looking back at your baby's 3 years old?
I know. And I don't think it'll ever be Gatsby, but, yeah, I think it's had a really lasting impacts because it's one, I find, every time Métis Week comes up, people start looking for Métis books. Every time International Women's Day starts coming up, people start looking for women's books. So it kind of completely inadvertently, it has this lasting power that people keep discovering it throughout the years. I actually did I brought two of the women from the book to Concordia 2 days ago, and we did a book, like basically a storytelling event at Concordia.
That's the university here in
Yeah,
Edmonton?
the
Yeah.
University of Concordia
Okay.
here in Edmonton, where we just talked about, the process of the book and mostly talked about the women's stories. These are two elders from my community who I look up to and respect very much, and I wanted them to showcase their story. I can get up there and talk for an hour, whatever, but I think it's more important to bring these women to tell the story of their childhood and what it was like growing up, and I think that impact has been the biggest impact for me, basically.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Well, we're gonna wrap up shortly, but not before a grand finale conclusion here, because on top of everything else that we've been discussing, you've taken on a whole new challenge at a national and an international level with the Métis National Council in Ottawa, where you don't need to be all the time,
No.
right? So you don't have to spend the winter wondering when the canal is going to open, which now has become very few days almost. For skating is what I mean. Open for skating, that's the big topic there. So how did this come about, and what's the biggest challenge so far that you find in this new challenge?
Yeah, I moved over to Métis National Council, pretty much exactly a year ago. Just in a week, it'll be exactly a year since I started working with Métis National Council as a senior policy advisor for intergovernmental relations. And I sometimes I like to joke because I went working with community every day and youth to working with government, which has been a huge change. And it's been a really interesting one, and it's taught me a lot about the way that the Métis Nation functions on a national level and an international level. So it's been a huge learning curve. One of the biggest things, going back to women for me, has been the international work I've done with the United Nations. So I've now had the opportunity to go twice, once as a delegate when I worked at Métis Nation of Alberta, and once as a staff member with Métis National Council. So
Oh, it's in New York?
this is in New York. So I attended the Commission on the Status of Women 67 and 68 in New York at the United Nations headquarters. So the first year I went as a delegate because I was vice president of New Dawn. And the next year, just I happened to be working on the team that leads that delegation.
Hmm.
So just complete coincidence, but really luckily, like I had the knowledge and the experience to be able to do that. Where I accompanied President Sandmeyer of Otipemisiwak Métis Government and previous President Karen of the Métis National Council.
Right.
I led them and basically got to meet women from around the world who are facing similar challenges that women within the Métis Nation of Alberta or the Otipemisiwak Métis Government face. And it's really given me a broader perspective on the importance of international work within the Métis Nation. We're very focused on what's going on at home, which makes a lot of sense. But moving into an international space and seeing that, like, women from around the world, specifically Indigenous women around the world, are facing similar issues and being able to discuss, how these issues impact us and different solutions we've come up with to handle similar issues, I think is really, really valuable and has been a huge eye opener for me.
So let's end on this because we're pretty much maxed out the period of time that we allocate. Otherwise, I'd talk to you for hours. But you hear about women's status of women. There's a federal minister has a position, I think, that has that title or did for some period of time. You have firsthand experience at the UN now. Why is that important? What does it have? What kind of policy, if that's the right way to look at it, implications does it have to make sure that women are represented like that at that level?
I think it shows, first off, just a level of respect that the Métis Nation is a nation in and of itself. And we deserve to have a space on an international level,
Yeah,
just like the
sure.
government of Canada does. We deserve, as a nation, to be able to have one-on-one conversations with other Indigenous nations from around the world. The other thing which I found very interesting, which I don't know if anyone else will, it's actually easier to get meetings with national politicians internationally. It's so funny. Like, we were in New York, and we had meetings with Minister Haiju, Minister Ian, with all of these people who you have to kind of, like, fight to get meetings with when you're in Canada. There's something about being on the international stage that allows for those conversations to happen. So I got to watch as, like, President Karen, President Sandmeyer were just meeting daily with all of these different federal politicians and being able to, like, actually, like, say, like, "These are the issues," and, like, a lot of it was focused on women, so, like, these are the issues the Métis Nation is having to access federal funding. These are the issues the Métis Nation has when it comes to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, in maybe a space that's a lot harder to get in Canada. It's really ironic, but it was a very real, tangible thing that I noticed happening.
Well, they call it, well, they used to call it water cooler chat. Now they call it, I don't know, they call it hallway breakouts. But like really so-called offline
Oh, yeah.
conversations are where things really actually
We
get
were in the
discussed.
middle of a food court, and people kept trying to steal our chairs. Like, we're having a meeting with, like, federal ministers, and people are like, "Can I have this table?" We're like, "We're using."
And that's the nature of humans, is that we set up these formalized environments, right? Like, and that's where you're talking publicly in the UN. It all looks very stuffy with the microphones and the translation equipment and everything. But really, meanwhile, that really the communique that's going to eventually come out, 90% of that resulted from some, food court conversation.
Genuinely a food court conversation.
It's so I guess one of the objectives going forward in life for you professionally might be, how do we get the kind of exposure we're getting to cabinet ministers, the Canadian senior political representatives in New York? Why are we not getting these meetings in Ottawa? Like, I'm not assuming you're not, but you should be getting more of that kind of exposure here at home, right?
And, like, my main focus within my role is working on the permanent bilateral mechanism, which is basically a mechanism with how within the Métis Nation and Canada Accord, with how the Métis Nation and Canada work together.
Right.
And what I've come to realize, it's not easy. It takes a lot of work to kind of get Canada to always come to the table and to uphold their obligations. It's challenging work. It's been a huge learning curve, but I've really, really enjoyed it, and I find I'm learning more than I thought I ever could have, and it's really broadened my understanding of the Métis Nation.
So I know I lied. I will have one more question. We'll end on this, I promise. Out of that process, where I guess we could either look at it, half glass half full, glass half empty. What's been the biggest benefit you've noticed in the last year, where progress has been made, or where do you feel there's gaps that may have shocked you when you took on the role, and those gaps still exist today, and then frustrates you? Which way do you want to answer?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think I've just been shocked at maybe the lack of progress that can happen when Canada doesn't wanna come to the table. But what kind of always gives me hope and what I keep pushing for is that, like, the Métis Nation is, like, strong and is not gonna stop pushing and is not, like, 2 steps forward, 1 step back every single time. And I've really kinda come to realize that, like, my life moving forward will be to support the Métis Nation in whatever way, shape, or form that is. And
Hmm.
yeah,
So you're a career advocate.
I guess so.
Is that to please other people, or because that's your ambition?
That is not the pathological piece plate there. That is me genuinely. There's a point in my time where I'm like, I'm not going to work at the Métis Nation of Alberta forever. But now it's just like, in some way, shape, or form, I will be advocating for Métis people.
Fantastic. Great place to stop. Bailey, you're so well known. When I came on this True Canadians project, I heard about you right away. We had opportunity to talk at various points, and I'm really glad that we've had an opportunity to have you come on and talk to us about youth and women and big national and international endeavors that you've undertaken. Congratulations on all of that, and thanks for being with us today.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.